Lorenzo Moretti bled out on the marble floors of his Chicago penthouse, his spine shattered by a rival's bullet. The ruthless boss of the Moretti syndicate swore no one would see him weak. Then she walked in. Isabella Marchetti. The only woman allowed to touch him. The only woman he would ever beg for. The Chicago winter was merciless, but it was nothing compared to the chill inside the Lake Forest estate of Lorenzo Moretti. The undisputed head of the Moretti syndicate, a man who had built an empire on blood, sharp suits, and sharper instincts, was now a prisoner in his own home. 3 months ago, an ambush orchestrated by the ambitious and psychotic Silvio Berardi had left Lorenzo with a bullet lodged against his lower spine. The doctors had saved his life, but they had taken his legs. The paralysis was a death sentence in the underworld. A boss who could not stand was a boss who could not rule. Lorenzo had transformed his palatial home into a fortress, heavily guarded by men armed with automatic weapons. Inside the master suite, it was a war zone of a different kind. Lorenzo had shattered mirrors, broken lamps, and violently dismissed 5 high-priced private nurses in the span of 3 weeks. He refused to be handled. He refused their pitying glances. Anyone who dared to look at his motionless legs with sympathy was met with a glass hurled at their head. He was a monster, caged in a high-tech medical bed, and the underworld was whispering that the Moretti empire was crumbling. Then the agency sent Isabella Marchetti. Isabella stepped out of the black SUV and pulled her thick wool coat tight around her soft, generous curves, bracing against the icy wind off Lake Michigan. She was not the typical sleek, waif-thin nurse the agency catered to elite clients. Isabella was plus-sized, her figure full and undeniable, with thick thighs and a soft stomach that she carried with a quiet, grounded confidence. She possessed a warmth that seemed out of place in the sterile, heavily armed compound, but behind her dark, expressive eyes lay a spirit forged in steel. She had grown up in the tough neighborhoods of the South Side, the daughter of a degenerate gambler who owed money to the worst kinds of people. She had learned early how to survive monsters. She was escorted into the master suite by 2 hulking enforcers who looked at her with a mixture of doubt and pity. The room was shrouded in darkness, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight against the midday sun. The air smelled of expensive scotch and antiseptic. "Get out!" a voice growled from the shadows. It was a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated in the chest, filled with raw menace. Isabella calmly set her medical bag on a glass table. The enforcers slipped out the door, leaving her alone with the devil of Chicago. She flicked on a bedside lamp, bathing the room in a warm glow and illuminating Lorenzo Moretti. Even battered and confined to a bed, Lorenzo was devastatingly handsome. His sharp jawline was covered in dark, rough stubble, and his eyes, a piercing, stormy grey, locked onto hers with predatory fury. He gripped a heavy crystal tumbler in his right hand, his knuckles white. "I said get out," Lorenzo repeated, his voice dangerously low. "I don't need another bleeding heart Florence Nightingale hovering over me. Leave before I make my men throw you out." Isabella did not flinch. She took off her coat, revealing dark blue scrubs that hugged her full hips and large bust. She walked straight to the side of his bed, well within striking distance. "My name is Isabella," she said, her voice steady, melodic, yet completely unyielding. "I am here to ensure your muscles don't atrophy and your wounds stay clean. I don't care if you run a corporation or a crime syndicate, Mr. Moretti. To me, you are a patient with a spinal injury. You can throw that glass at me if it makes you feel better. But I'll just make you clean it up." Lorenzo stared at her, stunned into a momentary silence. The sheer audacity of this woman, with her soft, rounded face and unapologetic curves, defying him in his own home, was unfathomable. He studied her. He expected her to tremble, to look away, to show the fear that every other person in his life displayed. Instead, she looked right back at him, seeing past the Mafia boss, past the paralysis, straight into the man. "I don't like being touched," he finally snarled, lowering the glass an inch. "It's medical care, not a massage," Isabella replied smoothly, opening her bag. "Let's start with your vitals." Over the next 2 hours, Lorenzo did everything he could to intimidate her. He cursed, he gripped the bed rails until the metal groaned, and he hurled insults. Isabella remained infuriatingly calm. Her hands were surprisingly strong, her touch firm, but incredibly gentle as she manipulated his useless legs through a series of physical therapy exercises. There was no pity in her touch, only a grounded, practical care that grounded him. When she finished, she wiped her brow, a faint flush on her cheeks. "I'll be back tomorrow at 8 in the morning. Don't break any more lamps. They're terrible for the carpet." As she turned to leave, Lorenzo felt a strange, terrifying jolt in his chest. A sudden, violent possessiveness washed over him, entirely alien to his usual cold calculation. The scent of her vanilla lotion lingered in the room, masking the smell of rubbing alcohol. "Wait," Lorenzo commanded. Isabella paused at the door, looking back over her shoulder. He picked up the phone beside his bed, hitting a speed dial button. His underboss, Marco, answered immediately. "Marco," Lorenzo said, his stormy grey eyes never leaving Isabella's soft, flushed face. "Cancel the rest of the nurses from the agency. Fire the night staff. From now on, only Isabella touches me. No one else is allowed in this room for my care." "Understood." He hung up the phone. Isabella raised a thick eyebrow, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs, though she refused to show it. "See you tomorrow, Lorenzo," she said, dropping the formal title. The ensuing weeks descended into an intoxicating, high-stakes routine. The isolation of the Lake Forest estate became a crucible, trapping Lorenzo and Isabella in a volatile dance of defiance and undeniable attraction. Lorenzo's physical world had shrunk to the size of his bedroom and the adjoining therapy gym, but his mind remained a dangerous, sprawling web of mafia politics. He ran his empire from a wheelchair, barking orders, authorizing hits, and managing the illicit flow of cash through Chicago's underworld. Through it all, Isabella was his constant shadow. She was the anchor keeping his rage from consuming him. Lorenzo's obsession with his curvy nurse grew with a frightening intensity. He found himself tracking her movements around the room, mesmerized by the sway of her hips and the soft, heavy weight of her breasts pressing against the thin fabric of her scrubs when she leaned over him to adjust his IV or check his incisions. In a world where everyone lied to him, Isabella's blunt honesty was a drug. He learned about her past, prying details from her during painful physical therapy sessions. When she mentioned her late father's gambling debts and the brutal men who used to knock on their door, Lorenzo's blood ran cold with a murderous protective instinct. He made a silent vow that no one would ever bring harm to her again. But the outside world was closing in. Silvio Berardi was not content with merely paralyzing the king. He wanted the throne. Whispers turned into shouts as Berardi's men began encroaching on Moretti territory in the south side, hitting their shipments and shaking down their front businesses. The syndicate capos were getting nervous. They needed to see their boss. They needed to know Lorenzo was still a predator, not prey. The stress was fracturing Lorenzo's iron control. One evening, after a particularly disastrous phone call regarding a hijacked weapons shipment, the atmosphere in the master suite was suffocatingly tense. Snow beat against the reinforced glass windows. Lorenzo was transferring himself from his wheelchair to the bed, a maneuver he usually completed with grueling upper body strength, refusing any help. But tonight, exhaustion and fury clouded his focus. His arms shook, his grip slipped on the transfer board, and with a sickening thud, he collapsed onto the hardwood floor, his deadened legs twisted awkwardly beneath him. "Lorenzo!" Isabella gasped, dropping a tray of medications. She rushed to his side, her thick, warm thighs hitting the floor beside him as she reached out to support his shoulders. "Don't touch me!" he roared, batting her hands away with vicious force. His chest heaved, his face flushed with a toxic mixture of rage and profound, soul-crushing humiliation. He was the boss of the Cosa Nostra. He ordered men to their deaths with a flick of his wrist. And here he was, a helpless cripple thrashing on the floor like a dying fish. "Get away from me, Isabella," he spat, squeezing his eyes shut to stop the burning tears of frustration. "Just leave. Pack your bags and get the hell out of my house." Isabella did not move. Any other woman, any of his hardened soldiers, would have fled from the sheer venom in his voice. But Isabella stayed on her knees beside him. She knew a wounded animal bit hardest when it was in pain. She saw past the terrifying Mafia Don to the broken man who was terrified of losing his power, his dignity, and his life. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice a fierce whisper that cut through his shouting. She moved closer, her soft body pressing against his rigid, trembling frame. She ignored his protests, sliding her arms under his broad shoulders and wrapping him in a fierce, unyielding embrace. She pulled his head against her deep, pillowy cleavage, burying her fingers in his thick, dark hair. "You don't get to push me away, Lorenzo," she murmured, rocking him slightly. "You don't have to be the ruthless boss every single second of the day. Not with me. Just let go." Lorenzo froze. The scent of vanilla and warm skin flooded his senses, the softness of her breasts against his face, the steady, calming thump of her heartbeat beneath his ear. It broke him. The walls he had spent a lifetime building, the walls that had only thickened since the bullet tore through his spine, suddenly crumbled into dust. He let out a jagged, broken breath that sounded entirely too much like a sob. His massive arms came up, wrapping around her thick waist, gripping her scrubs as if she were the only thing keeping him from falling off the edge of the earth. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling her deeply, trembling violently against her curves. "Isabella," he choked out, his voice stripped of all its command, reduced to a desperate, raw rasp. "Don't leave me." "I'm right here," she whispered, kissing the top of his head, her own tears pricking her eyes as she held this terrifying, beautiful, broken man. "Please," Lorenzo begged, the word foreign and jagged on his tongue. It was a word a Moretti never used, never. But he was starving for connection, for acceptance, for her. "Touch me. Don't stop touching me. You're the only thing that makes me feel alive. Please." Isabella's hands moved slowly down his broad back, soothing the tight, coiled muscles. As she shifted to get a better angle to help him up, her plush thigh brushed heavily against his lap. Lorenzo gasped, pulling back just enough to look up into her dark eyes. The vulnerability in his stormy grey gaze was rapidly being swallowed by something darker, something fiercely possessive and raw with hunger. Isabella felt it too. A heavy, thick heat pooling in her stomach. The air between them crackled with an electric, dangerous energy. He wasn't just asking for comfort anymore. He was begging for her. "Let me help you to the bed," she said, her voice suddenly breathy and strained. Lorenzo's hands slid from her waist to grip her lush, full hips, his long fingers pressing into her soft flesh with claiming intensity. "I don't want to go to sleep, Isabella," he whispered, his eyes dropping to her lips. Just as the tension reached a breaking point, the heavy oak door to the master suite swung violently open. Marco stood in the doorway, his face pale, a handgun gripped tightly in his fist. "Boss," Marco said, out of breath, his eyes darting from Lorenzo on the floor to the woman holding him. "We have a massive problem. Berardi just hit the South Warehouse, and he sent a message. He knows you're paralyzed. He's calling for a sit-down of the 5 families to strip you of your title." Lorenzo's expression morphed instantly. The vulnerable man vanished, replaced by the lethal, cold-blooded king of the Chicago underworld. He looked at Isabella, his jaw set like granite. "Help me up," he commanded, the gravelly authority back in his voice. "We have a war to win. And Berardi is going to bleed for every inch of my territory." Isabella nodded, wrapping her arms around him once more, pulling him up from the floor. As she hoisted him into his wheelchair, Lorenzo caught her hand, pulling her knuckles to his lips for a brief, searing kiss. "Stay close to me," he murmured, his eyes flashing with lethal intent. "Because if Silvio Berardi thinks he can take what's mine, he's about to find out exactly what kind of monster I really am." The morning of the sit-down, the Lake Forest estate felt like a powder keg waiting for a match. Lorenzo Moretti was not a man who surrendered, but the rules of the Chicago Commission were ancient and unforgiving. A boss who could not physically lead his men in a time of war was a liability. Silvio Berardi knew this. He had called the meeting at a neutral location, a closed high-end Italian restaurant in the Fulton Market district, expecting to strip the crown from a crippled king. In the master suite, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken fears and raw determination. Isabella stood behind Lorenzo, adjusting the collar of his custom-tailored charcoal suit. It was the first time she had seen him in his armor. The dark fabric accentuated the broad, terrifying width of his shoulders and the dangerous, predatory set of his jaw. Despite the wheelchair, he looked every inch the ruthless ruler of the Moretti syndicate. "I am coming with you," Isabella said quietly, her hands smoothing the silk tie against his chest. Lorenzo caught her wrist, his grip iron tight but careful not to bruise. "Absolutely not. The commission is a den of vipers. Berardi is a rabid dog. It is going to be a bloodbath, Isabella. I will not have you in the crossfire." "You need a medical proxy," she countered, refusing to break eye contact. "Your blood pressure has been spiking. If you suffer an autonomic dysreflexia episode during this meeting, you will collapse. You need me there to monitor you. Besides, nobody looks twice at a nurse." Lorenzo stared at her, his stormy grey eyes searching her soft, resolute face. He saw the street-smart girl from the South Side, the woman who had survived monsters of her own. He saw his anchor. With a heavy sigh that sounded like a concession to defeat, he pulled her hand to his mouth, kissing her knuckles. "You stay behind me," he ordered, his voice a gravelly whisper. "If shooting starts, you drop to the floor, and you do not move until Marco or I tell you to. Understand?" "I understand," she lied softly. The Fulton Market restaurant was heavily guarded. Marco and 5 of Lorenzo's most lethal enforcers cleared the perimeter, but the inside belonged to the commission. The heads of the 4 other families sat around a massive mahogany dining table, smoking cigars and sipping espresso. At the far end sat Silvio Berardi. He was a lean, rat-faced man with a tailored suit and a smug, hungry smile that made Isabella's skin crawl. When Marco wheeled Lorenzo into the room, a heavy silence fell. Isabella walked a step behind the chair, her medical bag slung over her shoulder, her dark scrubs swapped for a modest black dress that hugged her lush curves. She felt the eyes of the room slide over her, dismissive and predatory, but she kept her gaze fixed on the back of Lorenzo's head. "Well," Silvio mocked, spreading his hands. "The fallen king graces us with his presence. And he brought his babysitter. Tell me, Lorenzo, do we need to pause the meeting for your diaper change?" A few of Berardi's capos chuckled. Lorenzo did not even blink. He wheeled himself to the head of the table, his posture radiating cold, lethal authority. "I am here to listen to you beg for your life, Silvio," Lorenzo said, his voice carrying the calm, dead weight of a loaded gun. "You hit my south warehouse. You step on my territory. I came to see if the Commission sanctions this suicide mission, or if you are acting alone like the stray dog you are." The tension in the room skyrocketed. Thomas Rossi, the eldest boss of the Commission, cleared his throat. "Lorenzo, the rules of Cosa Nostra are clear. A boss must be able to lead. Silvio claims you are incapacitated. He claims the Moretti family is weak. We are here to vote on transferring your territories to him to keep the peace in Chicago." While the bosses debated the politics of the underworld, Isabella stood quietly in the shadows, her eyes scanning the room. Her father had owed money to bookies, loan sharks, and enforcers. She had spent her childhood learning how to read the subtle body language of dangerous men. She watched the waiters, who were supposedly neutral staff provided by the Commission. One waiter, a tall man with a scarred jaw, kept glancing at Silvio. He was moving toward Lorenzo's side of the table, carrying a silver tray with a fresh carafe of water and a glass. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs. She recognized him. It was Tommy Blades, a low-level hitman who used to run numbers in her old neighborhood. He was not a waiter. He was on Berardi's payroll. Tommy reached the table and reached into his jacket, bypassing the carafe. "Gun!" Isabella screamed, her voice shattering the tense negotiation. She did not drop to the floor, as Lorenzo had ordered. Acting on pure, protective adrenaline, Isabella lunged forward, throwing her heavy medical bag directly at Tommy's face. The heavy canvas struck the hitman, just as he pulled a suppressed pistol from his coat. The shot went wild, shattering a chandelier above the table. Chaos erupted. Lorenzo reacted with terrifying speed. From a hidden holster bolted under the armrest of his wheelchair, he drew a heavy-caliber handgun. Before Tommy could recover from Isabella's strike, Lorenzo put 2 bullets in his chest. The neutral ground became a war zone. Berardi's men drew their weapons, but Marco and the Moretti enforcers breached the dining room doors, laying down suppressive fire. The older bosses flipped tables, scrambling for cover. Lorenzo grabbed Isabella's dress, hauling her down behind the reinforced steel frame of his specialized wheelchair. "Stay down," he roared, his eyes wild with the thrill of battle and sheer terror for her life. Silvio Berardi was crawling toward the back exit, trying to escape the bloodbath he had started. Lorenzo tracked him, his hands steady despite the chaos. He fired once, blowing out Silvio's kneecap. The rat-faced boss screamed, collapsing onto the marble floor. The gunfight lasted less than 60 seconds. When the smoke cleared, Berardi's men were dead or disarmed. Lorenzo's enforcers had secured the room. Lorenzo wheeled himself forward, his gun aimed squarely at Silvio's head. The room was dead silent, save for the pathetic whimpering of the usurper. "You think because my legs do not work, my trigger finger is broken?" Lorenzo asked softly, the menace in his voice freezing the blood of everyone listening. You think a wheelchair makes me less of a monster, Silvio? Please, Lorenzo, Silvio begged, spitting blood. We can make a deal. I do not make deal with dead men, Lorenzo replied. He pulled the trigger. The silence that followed was absolute. Lorenzo turned his chair to face the remaining bosses of the commission. Any other questions about my ability to lead this syndicate? Thomas Rossi slowly raised his hands in surrender. The Moretti territories remain yours, Lorenzo. The commission recognizes your strength. Lorenzo did not care about Rossi's validation. His eyes frantically scanned the room until he found Isabella. She was leaning against a shattered mahogany pillar, her chest heaving, a small cut on her cheek from flying glass. She was shaking, but she was alive. Let's go home, Lorenzo commanded. The SUV ride back to the Lake Forest estate was a blur of flashing city lights and deafening silence. The adrenaline that had kept them both moving through the shootout at the Fulton Market restaurant was beginning to crash, leaving a raw, terrifying reality in its wake. Lorenzo had won. He had secured his empire, silenced his enemies, and proved to the Chicago underworld that he was still the undisputed king. But as the heavy iron gates of the estate closed behind them, Lorenzo felt none of the usual triumph. All he felt was a crushing, suffocating terror. Once they were inside the master suite, Marco and the guards retreated, leaving them completely alone. The heavy oak doors clicked shut. Isabella dropped her ruined medical bag onto the floor. Her hands were shaking violently now. The reality of what she had done, throwing herself at a mob hitman, was finally catching up to her. She walked over to the bathroom sink, turning on the cold water to wash the dried blood from her hands. She could hear the faint whir of Lorenzo's wheelchair moving up behind her. Why did you do that? Lorenzo's voice was not a roar this time. It was a low, jagged rasp, vibrating with an emotion so intense it felt dangerous. Isabella turned off the tap, gripping the edges of the marble sink. She did not turn around. He was going to shoot you. I told you to drop to the floor, Lorenzo said, closing the distance until the footrests of his chair bumped gently against the back of her legs. I told you to stay out of the crossfire. You could have been killed, Isabella. You stepped in front of a bullet for me. Because I could not watch you die, she snapped, finally turning around to face him. Tears were spilling over her thick lashes, tracking down her flushed, rounded cheeks. Her chest heaved, pressing the fabric of her black dress outward. I know who you are, Lorenzo. I know you are a ruthless mafia boss. I know you order hits and run a criminal empire. But to me, you are the man who lets me see the cracks in his armor. You are the man who begged me not to leave him. I could not let him take you from me. Lorenzo stared at her, his chest tightening so painfully he thought his heart might actually rupture. He reached out, his large, calloused hands gripping her thick hips. He pulled her forward, ignoring the awkwardness of the chair until she was standing between his knees. He looked up at her, his stormy grey eyes entirely stripped of the cold mobster. They were filled with absolute, consuming worship. You are a fool, Isabella Marchetti, he whispered, burying his face in the soft, generous curve of her stomach. A beautiful, brave, perfect fool. Isabella gasped as his hands moved up her sides, tracing the lush, full lines of her figure that so many other men had overlooked or criticized. To Lorenzo, she was not just beautiful. She was a goddess who had descended into his personal hell and dragged him back to the light. He pulled back just enough to look at her face. Look at me, he commanded softly. She met his gaze, her breath hitching. Before you walked into this room, I was a dead man, Lorenzo said, his thumbs brushing the tears from her cheeks. I was a ghost haunting my own house, waiting for someone like Silvio Berardi to put me out of my misery. I hated the world, and I hated myself. But then you looked at me. You didn't see a cripple, and you didn't see a monster. You just saw me. Isabella's hands came up, threading into his dark, thick hair. Lorenzo, I am completely, hopelessly obsessed with you, he confessed, the dark romance of his vow hanging heavy in the quiet room. You are mine, Isabella. You belong to me now. Not as my nurse, not as my employee, as my queen. I will burn Chicago to the ground before I let anyone touch a single hair on your head. Isabella felt a fierce, answering heat ignite in her core. She didn't want to run from this dangerous world anymore. She wanted him. She wanted the man who commanded armies, but bowed only to her. Then show me, she challenged, her voice a sultry, demanding whisper. Prove to me that you're mine. Lorenzo let out a dark, hungry growl, his powerful arms wrapped around her thick waist, lifting her effortlessly despite his seated position. He pulled her down onto his lap. Isabella straddled his paralyzed legs, her plush thighs pressing against his hips. The sudden, intimate contact sent a shock wave of electricity through them both. Lorenzo's mouth crashed onto hers. There was no hesitation, no holding back. It was a claiming, a brand forged in blood and adrenaline and desperate, starving need. He kissed her fiercely, his tongue parting her lips, tasting the salt of her tears and the sweet, intoxicating flavor that was uniquely hers. Isabella melted against him, her soft, heavy curves pressing flush against his hard, muscular chest. She answered his kiss with equal ferocity, her hands gripping his broad shoulders. She felt the raw, primal strength of his upper body as he shifted her, pulling her tighter against him. His hands were everywhere, worshipping the fullness of her hips, the dip of her waist, the heavy weight of her breasts spilling over the neckline of her dress. You are so incredibly beautiful, Lorenzo murmured against her neck, his lips blazing a trail of fire down her skin, making her arch her back with a soft, breathy moan. Every inch of you. Perfect. Mine. The constraints of the wheelchair, the reality of his paralysis, none of it mattered in the darkness of the master suite. They found a rhythm, a desperate, passionate connection that transcended physical limitations. Lorenzo was a man who had lost his ability to walk, but he had found something far more powerful. He had found a reason to live, a reason to fight, and a woman who matched his darkness with her own unyielding light. They moved to the bed, entirely lost in each other. The Mafia boss and his curvy nurse stripped away the last of their defenses, laying their souls bare in the quiet aftermath of the storm. Months later, the underworld of Chicago would whisper about the new era of the Moretti Syndicate. They spoke of Lorenzo Moretti, the paralyzed Don who ruled with an iron fist and a terrifying, cold-blooded efficiency. But more than that, they whispered about the woman by his side. Isabella Moretti, the undisputed queen of the Chicago Mafia. She was soft, warm, and fiercely protected. No one dared look at her twice, and no one dared question the boss's strength, because everyone knew the truth. Lorenzo Moretti was a lethal weapon, but Isabella was the one holding the trigger. And as long as she was by his side, the King of Chicago would never fall again. Thank you so much for watching this gripping Mafia romance story. If Lorenzo and Isabella's intense, high-stakes journey kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button and share this video with your fellow dark romance lovers. What was your favorite moment from the shootout or their emotional confession? Let me know in the comments below. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell for more thrilling, gritty love stories.